There's a burning desire deep from within to delight in the Lord with all that I am. There's a flame of passion burning from the depths of my soul to find the Father's heartbeat wherever I would go.
Okay, so tonight need a little gap. Had a little gap to fill between we wrapped up the Doctrine of Man study last week. Next week we start the Forensic Faith study, and so that's going to be a lot of fun. Today what I wanted to do is look at a question that was actually brought up to me by a church member. A friend of theirs asked them, they had got their hands on a book that was kind of leading them to believe other things, and so they came to me concerned, and I thought, well, you know what, I'll just do a message on it. And so here we are. Who wrote the Gospels? Right? If someone were to ask you, who wrote the Gospels? What would you say? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? I mean, that's their names on them, right? It's the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, and so on. And however, there is a strain, and it's not a small one. There's a segment of modern scholarship that says, no, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not write the Gospels. And so, just to help out with that, I thought that's what we would talk about tonight. And so, just to let you know what's about to happen to you. I'm about to just dump a ton of information on you. You're about to suffer from information overload. However, that's what the notes are for. That's why I have this timeline. It'll get hung up back there in the back. You can check it out anytime you'd like. And so that's what's coming up. By way of full disclosure, just to make sure we understand what's going on here, I stole this information. I just let you know your pastor's a thief. Why reinvent the wheel, right? There are wonderful intellectual academics who have already done the heavy lifting. I'll just take what they've done and present it to you. So this message tonight has been heavily sourced from Tim McGrew. He is a professor of philosophy. He is a speaker, writer on these type issues. Brilliant guy, real nice guy too. And so whenever I say that I heavily resourced, I basically took a talk he did and stripped it and am using it as my own. Probably about this short of plagiarism. So just to let you know, great, brilliant guy, getting all my information from him. He has a website. Let me kind of dig myself out of the hole. He has a website called Historical Apologetics. It's loaded with old books. He once was given a talk, and a minister there at the church he was at said, I've never heard these things. Even in seminary, they didn't teach them. And he said, that's because you don't read enough old books. If you want to know a bunch of good stuff, read some old dead guys. There are books that are just packed full of this information that people nowadays just are not being taught. Well, now you can get it for free. Library of Historical Apologetics. You can check out that website there. So, okay. So why are we even going to bother talking about this? Because there's an objection that's out there. There's a criticism of Christianity that says we don't know who wrote the Gospels. But they certainly was not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They say we don't know who the authors are, but we know it wasn't those guys. And so that's what we're going to try to tackle some of tonight. Two reasons why they say this. One, they claim that the earliest copies do not have the name of the author. That whenever you dig out those old Greek manuscripts that are in some museum or library somewhere, that the very oldest copies we have don't actually have the name of an author. And they say that they were written far too late, way after, for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to have actually been the people who wrote them. Those are the claims, those are the objections. So let's take a look at those. The earliest copies do not name an author. Well, this is actually true. The very earliest copies that we have do not say the Gospel according to Mark, or the Gospel according to Matthew, or the Gospel according to John. They don't say it. It's just the book, missing a title. No author. So that one's true. Some of the very earliest copies we have are anonymous. This other objection, written far too late to have been written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. This one actually gets into some odd things. Let's get some quotes here, why they might think it's written later. Bart Ehrman. I've referenced him before. He is the, I don't know if he's the chair, but he's a professor of religion at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's considered to be an expert, a leading scholar in the field of biblical studies among secular intellectuals. He says some books, such as the Gospels, had been written anonymously only later to be ascribed a certain author who probably did not write them. So leading scholar in biblical studies says that the Gospels were written and then later they attach names to them. But that's not who really wrote them. Richard Dawkins, right? We've met him. He's the British biologist, big on evolution and atheism, probably the most popular atheist in the world. He says, the Gospels are not reliable accounts of what happened in the history of the real world. All were written long after the death of Jesus and also after the epistles of Paul, which mention none of the alleged facts of Jesus' life. He also says, nobody knows who the four evangelists were, but they almost certainly never met Jesus personally. And so if you were to go take a course in biblical studies at a secular university, this is what you're being taught. And so, we hear the statistics of how the younger generation is just leaving the churches, just going away, because they'll go to college. Signs indicate they start their doubts way before they get to college. But they go to college, and all of a sudden they have these professors that say, oh, yeah, those books, you can't trust them. They're made up. Right? And they don't know how to answer that. And so they go, wow, all these doubts I've been having, you just confirmed them, so they walk away from the church. So why do we think they're written late? Or why do they think they're written late? Well, one thing is, liberal scholars say that the Gospels could not possibly be written any earlier than 70 AD. Do you know what major event took place in 70 AD? Temple was destroyed. The Romans, the Jews had a little uprising. The Romans sacked the city of Jerusalem, set it on fire, and destroyed the temple. Now, why would that be important to the writing of the Gospels, that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD? Well, what do the Gospels contain regarding the destruction of the temple? Right? Jesus prophesies. He predicts it. He says that it's going to get destroyed. Well, to a liberal, secular mindset, predictions don't happen. Right? There's no such thing as prophecy. You can't assume that he knew what was going to happen in the future, so therefore, they believe that these books had to have been written afterwards, so that when the authors would have already known the temple was destroyed. So they made it up. Right? That's the secular, liberal scholar mindset that says the supernatural can't happen. It's not possible, that it had to have been later. Also, they say legends take time to develop. This idea that Jesus was going around casting out demons and performing miracles and healing people and walking on water, and that he was God in the flesh. They say, well, that's all stuff that was made up later. Right? The real person, yeah, okay, there was some guy, Jesus from Nazareth. He was a rabbi. He got a following, ended up getting himself killed. But he wasn't a miracle worker. He wasn't the Son of God. That all developed and added on later is the way they assume. Which it has to be much, much later. You have to go beyond a point where everyone remembers what really happened in order to make stuff up, right? If you're going to make up a fantastic claim about supernatural events of someone we all know, we're going to know you're lying, right? Because we know the person. So if someone's going to make something up, it has to be generations later. So that's why they think, well, it had to develop over time, because these things take time. You can't make up stories when people around know that they would be false stories. And they have this secular kind of naturalistic, right, the modern era, We know what's real. It's what's physical. It's what we can see and touch and taste and hear and smell. That's what's real. That's what they believe. And so through that mindset, miracles aren't possible. Resurrections aren't possible. Prophecies aren't possible. So all this fantastic stuff had to be added on later. And that's just automatically the lens through which they're viewing this issue. Okay? So how can we tell? Well, we've got a few ways that we can tell. There is internal evidence, right? If you want to know, is this document, is this thing that we're studying, is it going to be reliable? Is it genuine? There are some things you can check. One is consistency, right? Is the author consistent? Is the style of the author consistent? Right? Does the writer in the beginning of the book sound like the writer at the end of the book? Right? Is it a consistent within? This one's fun. Undesigned coincidences. I actually did a talk when I first got here on that. It was one of the first things I did. Really fun. It's where these trivial, almost insignificant details, that you would just kind of dismiss and not even think about, but you get a little bit from here and a little bit from over here and a little bit from over here, and they come together to make a full picture. That's the kind of thing that you don't plan. They're hidden in the trivia, the insignificant little details. And so that kind of shows that a work would be genuine. I actually bumped that up on the website so that it's there. You can go on the website and find that talk if you missed it back then. Other marks of authenticity, right? Different things that historians would look for to make sure someone is authentic if they kind of knew what they were talking about. I'm not going to go into details on any of this. This isn't what we're going to be looking at, but all of this right here, the Bible has tons of this evidence as well, but it's not what we're talking about tonight. Tonight we're going to look at external evidence. What is the evidence outside of the Bible that points to the Bible being genuine, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote those documents? The two we're going to be concerned with is authorship, attribution of authorship. What other people say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote those? Right? Well, where is the evidence in history of people who knew Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote those books? And then we're going to look at early use. Right? Because if people are quoting the Gospels, who do they say they're quoting? Right? When are they quoting them? How early? And so we'll be looking at that. There's also some ways that it integrates in other historical sources. We're going to look at that. Not tonight. All of these other things, right, that I just listed 6 categories of evidence. All of them have tons of information that show the Bible to be genuine and reliable. Tonight we're just going to look at these 2. First, attribution of authorship. How do we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the people who wrote those 4 books? Well, we actually get a clue of what to do from Augustine, or Augustine, however you want to pronounce that, back in about 400 AD. All right, so we've got our little timeline. I know you can't read it from out there. It'll be hung up later. And so our far end of our timeline is going to be 400 AD. That's when Augustine kind of gets this. And then we're going to work our way backwards, going all the way back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to see if they are actually the ones who wrote. Augustine, we've heard from him before. He's a big, important guy, right? A lot of the big theological stuff in doctrine throughout, church history is from him. Big, smart guy, big brain in church history. Well, he was arguing against a guy named Faustus. Faustus was a critic of Christianity, and he was arguing that you don't know who wrote those books. So even 1,600 years ago, right, 370 years after the death of Christ, you have Faustus arguing this very same thing. He's saying that you don't know who wrote those. And this was Augustine's response, and this kind of sets up how we are going to argue this. He says, why does nobody argue about the authorship of the works of Hippocrates? Right, the physician, big famous Greek physician. You've heard of the Hippocratic Oath. Well, that's Hippocrates. Augustine says, why doesn't anybody argue about his authorship? Right? And this is what he says. He says, because there is a succession of testimony to the book from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. So what he's saying is, no one doubts Hippocrates, because we can go to the time of Hippocrates and we know who he wrote, that he wrote it. And then on and on, there's like a line of succession where this information is passed on and passed on and passed on. Furthermore, he says, how do we know the authorship of the works of Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or Varro or any other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? Which is kind of a cool point that he says that, we're using that today, because next week we're going to start looking at, the study with J. Warner Wallace, cold case homicide detective, and he's going to be talking about evidence. And one of the important things that we have in Christianity is this chain of evidence. Right? On a crime scene, if you're watching your crime shows, CSI or NCIS or whatever it is you like to watch, well, what happens? At the crime scene, they find a piece of evidence. What do they do with it? Stick it in their pocket? No, they put it in one of those little baggies and seal it with a label that says what it is, where they found it. They sign their name. When they get back to the station, they check it into the evidence lockup, and the person signs for it when it was received. And anyone who handles that evidence signs for it, and it shows. You can see who had the evidence and when. There is a chain of custody of evidence. The same thing with information. We actually have a chain of custody, a chain of evidence going from the time of the gospel writers up to the present. We're going to start at Augustine, but up to that time, so that we can know that we have this chain of evidence. So how good is our chain of evidence? I'm glad you asked. It's kind of why we're here. We have these guys. We'll get into them all a little bit more, but just real quick, we have Tertullian of Carthage, Clement of Alexandria, Irenaeus of Lyons, the Muratorian fragment, Justin Martyr, and Papias of Aeropolis, as well as some others that we will talk about here in a little bit. Now, I do want to admit that there is a challenge when it comes to history. If you're not aware, paper does not last. Right? We are kind of at the mercy of whatever survived. We only have whatever documents we actually have. Does that make sense? We don't have the ones we don't have. We only have the ones we do have. And whenever it comes to ancient things, the stuff they were written on did not last. Papyrus was the most common thing that they used to write on, and it does not last. The elements are not kind to papyrus. Now here's the thing. There's a bunch of stuff that we know got written because it's referred to, but we don't actually have that document. So there are things where we'll be reading and it'll refer to the works of such and such by so-and-so. Okay, we know that person wrote a book. We don't have it. Of everything that we know was written, about 85% is lost. Which means that we only have about 15% of what we know was written. And we don't know about the stuff we don't know about. And much of what we do have comes in fragments. So whenever you're talking about writings, whenever you're talking about studying ancient writings, this is what you're looking at. This is probably would be a pretty common condition of a page of an ancient writing. And we're talking 2,000 years, right? They get a little worn around the edges, maybe a little hole there, Luckily with the Bible, we have so many copies, we can fill in the holes. But sometimes you don't even have that much of the page, right? Sometimes it's just worn out. And remember I said that sometimes we get fragments, right? And I mean fragments, itty-bitty pieces. I don't know if you remember several years ago, there was this whole hoopla about they found a fragment that talked about the wife of Jesus. Do you remember that? Did you hear about that? Yeah, they didn't find a book of anything talking about the wife of Jesus. They found a scrap of parchment the size of a business card. And on there it had the phrase, the incomplete sentence that had the word wife, air quotes, of Jesus. Never mind that the word for wife could actually mean sister or several other meanings, or just generic one. There's other meanings besides wife, and we don't even know what Jesus is talking about. Jesus was a common name back then. It's like naming someone Bob. They're all over the place, right? And so that was really not much of any information. But so just so we know, when we're talking about historical information and documents, sometimes we're not talking about much. However, that's the state of historical documents, but Christianity has an abundance of material. And so we're going to run through this. I'm going to run through fast. Okay, I'm going to run through these guys pretty quick. The information, all the little minute details, they're in your notes. They're on the timeline, which will be hanging up back there. But I just want you to see who these guys are and that the information is out there. Tertullian, in about the year 207. Okay, so we had Augustine in 400. He's saying Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are your authors. Now we get back here to 207, right? We back up a couple centuries. Tertullian, he writes that the Gospels were written by Matthew and John, who were apostles, and then also by Mark and Luke, who were apostolic men, which meant that they were associated with the apostles. And he says that they tell the same basic facts and information about Jesus. So he says, we have these Gospels, and they all say basically the same thing, and their authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay? And this is what's interesting. Year 207, he says that they bear the names of their authors from antiquity, and the ancient churches vouch for them and none others. He's saying, so all the way back to the beginning, the ancient churches, the original churches, these were the authors of the Gospels. These are the ones that they say are the Gospels. And so, because by Tertullian's time, fake Gospels were popping up. This is where you start getting your Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Judas and Gospel of, whoever. All right. Then you have Clement of Alexandria, about 180, so we jump forward about 25 years. Clement of Alexandria, he mentions that Mark wrote his gospel by request from the knowledge that he got from Peter's preaching in Rome. He mentions Matthew and Luke, that they were published first and they have the genealogies, and he mentions John's gospel was the last, and he wrote it at the urging of his friends. He's getting on in years, and people say, hey, John, you got a lot of good stuff. Why don't you write it down? So he did. All right, now you got Irenaeus. Irenaeus, 180, so about right around that same time. He mentions Matthew's gospel as the first one written. He mentions Mark as a disciple of Peter. He mentions Luke as a companion of Paul. And he mentions John, who published his gospel while living in Ephesus. So there we still have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the four gospel authors. Then we have the Muratorian, it's Italian. Hey, it's a Muratorian. I don't know. This fragment, it was discovered, it's named after the guy who discovered it. Right? He was an Italian archaeologist. He discovered this fragment. And it mentions Luke and John. Now, what we don't have is anything about Matthew and Mark. However, the first portion of the thing is missing. The early part is gone. They have it and they can tell it's missing, right? Because you saw what documents look like from back then. However, scholars basically assume the first part was probably about Matthew and Mark. So from there we have Luke and John. Back up another 20 years and you have Justin Martyr, another church father. He doesn't actually mention names. However, he says that Christians possess the memoirs of Jesus, also known as the Gospels. And he says that they were written by apostles and apostles' followers. He doesn't give names, but he mentions the type of people, which would fit Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he does identify two indirectly. He mentions that they tell us of such events as the visit of the Magi, which is recorded in Matthew, and he says that they tell of Jesus' agony in Gethsemane. Remember whenever he's just, night before his arrest and he's praying and he's just, sweating blood. That's recorded in Luke. So he doesn't actually mention Matthew and Luke by name, but he references their works. And he mentions that they are apostles or followers of apostles. However, the really fun thing is this guy Tatian. Tatian or Tatian, however you pronounce that, he is a pupil of Justin Martyr. So right around the same time, over about 150, you have this guy. Now, he is really cool because he produced a work that is called the Diatessaron, which is a harmonization of all four Gospels. But, you know, on Sundays, how we're going through the Gospel, and I've basically taken them and mashed them all together into one single story. That's what he did. And so here we have the Diatessaron. Now, we knew the Diatessaron was out there, right? Other works referred to it. Other church fathers and historians mentioned it, but we didn't have it. We couldn't find it. We didn't have a copy of it. They had all seemingly been lost. And so liberal scholars, remember, they don't think that the Gospels were early. They think they were 100 years, 200 years later and made up. And so they thought that the Diatessaron couldn't possibly contain Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially John, right? John was written way, way, way late according to them. And then in 1888, they discovered a copy. And it began with the words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," which is the opening verses of the book of John. And so we have that by 150 AD, Tatian had combined four Gospels into one single harmonized story, and it contains our four Gospels. Virtually every bit of our four Gospels. If you open your Bible, what you have in there is almost identical to what he has listed. There were some parts he didn't include. There were some things that he edited to make it fit and some things like that. But virtually the entire four Gospels are there. And only those four. There are no other Gospels. So this is showing that these four Gospels, by this time, by about 150 AD, these four Gospels were the authority. If you wanted to know about Jesus, this was it, these four Gospels. Which means that they were in wide circulation among the churches and that they were accepted as authoritative. Okay. We're going to back up a few years to Celsus, about 175. He's fun because he was an anti-Christian. He was a critic. He did not like Christianity. He wrote against Christianity. And we know some of the things that he wrote because there was a guy named Origen, a church father, who refuted this other guy's works, and he quoted him. And so we actually see some of the things that he was claiming. And everything that he attacks comes from the Gospels. From our four Gospels. He's not attacking the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas. He's attacking Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is one thing that he says. He says, "I could have written many other things about Jesus, but I have chosen these things from your own writings in order to wound you with your own weapons." Right? But in his quotes, he verifies that our four Gospels are the works that we know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so even the enemies of Christianity are helping us out. 125 AD, so we're backing up even further. We're getting closer and closer. This is about 100 years after the death of Christ. You have Papias. Papias tells us that Mark was the interpreter of Peter, and that Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language. Now, oracles just means revealed word, and so he wrote his writings. It says he wrote in the Hebrew language. Now, we don't have a Hebrew version of Matthew. We've only ever found the Greek. But so here's Papias, and he mentions Mark and Matthew. So going all the way back to 125. So we've worked all our way back. Right, here's resurrection of Jesus. Here's when the Gospels are written. We've gotten all the way back, just within a few years, maybe a couple of decades. And so we're almost to the finish line, and all the way along, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors. And so, just in case someone might think that I'm only giving you all of the positive evidence, what about the other evidence that shows they didn't write it? There is none. It's not there. They're virtually zero. And I say virtually because there is one little group of people. They are called the alogi, which means deniers of the word. they did not believe Jesus was God. So they did not believe the book of John was actually written by the Apostle John. That was it, one book. And their denial was based on theological reasons because they didn't want to accept Jesus as God. And we actually don't have anything from these people. The only reason we know that they exist is because someone else was writing about them. They were like a footnote in someone else's writing, not even a major thing. And the comment they had to make about them was actually poking fun, because the term alogi could mean deniers of the word, right? Because your Greek logos means word, but it also serves double duty because it basically also means reason, wisdom, rationality. So kind of a play on words is that they're not, they're deniers of the word, deniers of Jesus, but they're also deniers of reason, deniers of logic, deniers of wisdom, right? And so the only mention we have of these people that we even know they even existed was someone poking fun at them because their ideas were ridiculous. And so there is actually no evidence of anyone else. There are no other claims of authorship. None. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the only authors ever offered for those writings. Well, someone might say it's all a conspiracy, right? It's all collusion, the church people all getting together and making all this up so that they could have this power over the church members. That's a very common answer that I hear about the Bible. The Bible, that's just people put together this book, and it was religious rules to keep people in line to control the masses. Well, the only problem is the Roman Empire is pretty big. All right, and four main guys that we mentioned there, Irenaeus is over there in Lyons. Did you pick on the accent? Where's he at? He's in France. All right. And you have Clement over here in Alexandria. That's in Egypt. Okay. Papias up there in Areopolis in Asia Minor. And Tertullian over there in Carthage in northern Africa. If there was any collusion going on here, what were they doing it by email? No. Remember, they getting on their Facebook and having a little, maybe on Google Hangouts and having like a little FaceTime chat. They're Skyping with one another to kind of make sure they're all on the same page. No, these guys are spread all over the place. You do not get together easily, right? And so there is no collusion. There's no conspiracy going on here. It is just the information that they have and the teaching of the church uniform across the empire is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the four Gospels. So there is no rival tradition for the authorship of the four Gospels. And the evidence is significant, it is early, and it is diverse. Geographically diverse, it's all over the place. It's not all coming from like Rome, or it's not just all coming from Jerusalem. It's all over the empire. Any questions on any of that? We need to move along, but any thoughts or questions on any of that? Right? Like I said, it's going to be an information dump. Church father after church father after church father, each affirming Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now we have another category called early uses. These are people who they don't name the author, but they quote the work. And so we actually see, early uses of this. Many early writers make use of the Gospels without naming or describing their authors, and this gets us even further back closer to the time of the writing. Excuse me. The fact that these people use the Gospels shows that these four writings, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are taken as authoritative. They are widely accepted. If you're going to quote something, you're expecting that your audience, A, knows what you're talking about, and B, they accept it as an authority, right? And so that means that by this time, the writings are widely accepted and recognized. And so who do we have that are quoting this? You have Basilides in 125 AD. He's a heretic. not a real Christian, but he wanted to be. And so if you want to look good in a Christian world, you have to quote the Bible. And so he does, and he quotes from John multiple times. You have Ignatius. Now we're bumping up. We're getting to 107, right? So we're even closer, just a few years after the death of John. Ignatius writes a letter to a guy named Polycarp. And he quotes Matthew 10:16. He says, "In all circumstances, be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove." Wonder where he got that from. Polycarp writes a letter to Philippians. We know those guys. Paul visited there. He planted a church. He wrote a letter. And Polycarp, in his letter, he quotes, he says, "Blessed are the poor and those persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God." Well, that sounds familiar because it's from Luke chapter 6. Actually, Polycarp, in his letter, he quotes from Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Hebrews, and 1 Peter. So, making wide use of the Bible. Actually, it's been estimated. I don't think anyone has ever actually done. It'd probably be too big of an undertaking to really calculate it. But it's been estimated that if every single Bible in the world disappeared overnight, we could recreate the New Testament from the quotations of the church fathers. They quoted the New Testament so often, almost virtually the entire New Testament is quoted within their writings. We could just piece it all back together. So we're talking about this chain of custody. Well, remember, we have Irenaeus, right? He's over in Lyon in France. And he says, the authors of the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? That's what he said. Well, where did he learn that from? We know that Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, right? We just heard about him. He's the one that wrote the letter that cited the Bible. So you think he knew something about the Bible? Yeah, he did. Well, who was he a student of? Where did he learn that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the authors of the Bible? Well, he was a student of the Apostle John. Do you think the Apostle John knew who wrote the four Gospels? You think maybe he was kind of cued in on Matthew, Mark, and Luke? I'm pretty sure he knew who wrote John, right? Because he did. So we have this chain of custody. So from the very earliest time, you have the Gospels who are circulating, which it is not easy to copy a book, right? Luke and Matthew in particular, those things are massive. And to copy them by hand, and what do you do if you make a mistake? You know, you don't get your white out, you don't get the eraser, you don't hit the backspace key. You got to toss out the whole scroll and start over again. And so the fact that these were being copied and spread all over the empire is very telling of how well they were accepted. I don't know that if you can see that too well there. This is a list of all of the major church fathers and their mention of the Gospels. We list Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Everywhere you see a check mark is where they actually mention the author by name. Where there is an X, they mention, they refer to the work, and then the blanks are where they don't mention it at all. And so, I mean, you can start with Ignatius and Polycarp. The two there in red, those are actually not Christians, but they still reference the Bible. When you go all the way, I mean, look how much it's referenced. The four Gospels and the book of Acts are referenced so much over and over and over again by the early church that it is just, you don't get better historical attestation than that. You don't get better evidence than that. Now, the claim often is that the church got together and they just picked and choose which books they wanted to include, right? And people often bring up like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Judas. Well, there's those other Gospels for comparison. How many times are they referenced or quoted or referred to? Virtually none. All right, so we can see which books are important to the church, and we can see who are they claiming and giving credence to. All right. So why do people think they're not genuine? All of this evidence. And I've said this before, and skeptics don't like it, but you would have to have a level of skepticism that would throw out the entire discipline and pursuit of historical study If you're not willing to accept the Bible as genuine, you can't accept anything as genuine. It is far more attested to historically than any other writing. However, they have their reasons. Let's go back to Bart Ehrman. He actually says, this is one of the reasons he gives for why he doesn't think Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. He says that Matthew's gospel is written completely in the third person. Even when the gospel narrates the events of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him and not about me. Right? So he's figuring, hey, if Matthew was writing it, when it got to the part where he was talking about himself, wouldn't he say me? Wouldn't he use first person pronouns? But no, it's right in third person. So he says that it is not. All right, so let's take a look at that. Matthew 9:9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. So there you go. Matthew is referring to himself in third person. Bart Ehrman says this shows Matthew didn't write it. Because if Matthew wrote it, Matthew would have said me. But he didn't. Well, the only problem is, remember Augustine? He had that argument with Faustus. Faustus had the exact same critique. He actually argued the exact same thing. And this is what Augustine said. He said, Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew was not the writer of the gospel. Because when speaking of his own election, he says not, he saw me and said to me, but instead he writes, he saw him and said to him. And this is Augustine getting a little snarky. Says this must have been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as to not have read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another author. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself in hope of getting a hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. And he quotes, here's some evidence. There's a historian named Xenophon, and it has a quote here from his own writing where he talks about that in the army there was a certain Xenophon, talking about himself, an Athenian who accompanied the army neither as general nor captain nor as a private soldier, but Proxenos, an old acquaintance, had sent for him. So we have an example of an author referring to himself in third person. The same thing also happens in Caesar's commentaries, Josephus' Jewish Wars, Nicolaus' History, and Dixippus' Sithica, and on and on. It was a very common literary device that an author not insert themselves into the story, but that whenever it does encounter them, they write in the third person. Very common in ancient writing. So sorry, Bart, that one doesn't hold up. Well, but he's not going to let Matthew off the hook. He says in Matthew, there is no mention of Jesus being God. But in the book of John, Jesus is quite very clearly described to be God. And so he says there's this tension between Matthew and John. And if these two had been apostles, if Matthew was an apostle, if John was an apostle, they walked and lived with Jesus, surely they would have had the same thing to say about him. Well, the only problem is Matthew actually does describe Jesus as being God. In Matthew 1:3, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Okay. Matthew 3:3 says, for this is he who was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah, when he said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So Matthew, referring to John the Baptist, quotes an Old Testament prophecy. So his readers, being Jewish, would have known what he was referring to. When you go back to Isaiah, what does Isaiah say? It mentions a voice who cries, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. And just so there's no confusion, whenever you look in your Bible and you see the word Lord, all four letters capitalized, What does that mean? What's the actual word? The name, Yahweh. The Jews would not actually write the name Yahweh. They weren't worthy to. So whenever they translated it, it would be translated Lord. So when you see in your Bible, Lord, L-O-R-D, all four letters capitalized, it's referring to the name Yahweh. So right here, Matthew is saying that Jesus is Yahweh. But yet, Bart wants to claim that Matthew does not say Jesus is God. Matthew 9, we have the story of the paralytic. Remember this one? Friends haul him up on the roof, chop a hole in the roof, and lower him down. And it says Jesus saw their faith. He said to the paralytic, "Take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven." And what happened when he said that your sins are forgiven? The Jews start freaking out and accusing him of blasphemy. Why? Because only God can forgive sins. Who do you think you are saying his sins are forgiven? Only God can forgive sins. And what does Jesus do? He says, well, okay, what's easier, to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? But to prove the point to you, hey, get up and walk. Heals the guy gets up and walks. What's that but Jesus making the statement, yeah, I'm God. I can forgive sins. I can heal him and I can forgive sins. And so, clearly, again, strike out there. And just a third other point. This is where he claims ignorance, that the authors of the Gospels, they're things they just don't know what they're talking about. He says their ignorance of Palestinian geography and Jewish customs suggests they compose their works somewhere else. They make statements about the Jews and about things that are just wrong, he claims. In Mark 7:3, it says that the Pharisees and all of the Jews washed their hands before eating so as to observe the tradition of the elders. It says this is not true. Most Jews did not engage in this ritual. That's according to Bart Ehrman, leading Bible scholar. And the reason he gives is because in Exodus and in Leviticus, the laws about ritual washings are addressed to the priests, not to everybody. And so he says that not everybody did it. That was just for the priests. Okay, well, that may have been what was said in Exodus. But in Jesus' time, the Jews of Jesus' time were like over-the-top crazy zealots. They were fanatical. It's what's called Second Temple Judaism. Remember, they come back from captivity and rebuild the temple, and then this is kind of the strain of Judaism that comes from that. Like, they went from being so horribly wicked that God destroyed their nation and sent them into exile, that they rebounded to the other side of being so fanatical, legalistic, they were adding to the law and making up new rules. And one of the rules that they made up was the washing of hands. What happens in John chapter 2? Jesus goes to a wedding. And what happens at the wedding? They run out of booze. So what does Jesus do? Turns the water into wine. And what does he use to turn the water into wine? It says, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. Each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. How big of a container holds 30 gallons? How many people are needing to wash that you need a container big enough to hold 30 gallons? That means it was a very common, widespread practice. Well, maybe John's just wrong too. So let's look at some other stuff. Letter of Aristeas, 200 BC, says, as is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea and prayed to God. Well, this is before Jesus. The custom of all the Jews? This is hyperbole. This is a way of writing that means almost everybody. Right? Surely there were people who didn't follow the practice, but it was so widespread and common that you just say everyone was doing it, right? Philo, he was around the same time, right around the time of Jesus. He wrote, the law does not look upon those who have even touched a dead body, which has met with a natural death, as pure and unclean until they have washed and purified themselves with sprinklings and ablutions. So this is Philo at the time of Jesus saying that according to the law, you're not clean if you touch a dead body. He doesn't say just priests. He's talking about everybody. So that was the understanding at the time of Jesus. And other modern scholarly opinions say that the concept of purification and purity were central in Jesus' day. They applied to everyone, not just the priests, even the Jews in the diaspora. The ones who, remember, when the Assyrians attacked Israel, what did they do? They dispersed the Jews. And whenever the Jews came back from Babylon, the ones who'd been dispersed by the Assyrians, most of those did not come back. They just lived across the different regions of the world. And it says that even those Jews followed these rituals. And so it's just a simple matter of historical fact that Bart Ehrman is wrong on that one also. And those are just three. And you can go at this all day, day after day after day. Every time they're refuted in one thing, they come up with something else, because from their point of view, they cannot allow that the Gospels be reliable and genuine as the evidence points to. Their worldview will not uphold it. Let's see. We saw that there's some consistency between Matthew and John, right? We saw that stuff going on. So, okay, that was a pass. Our external evidence, right? We had the authorship there. That was a pass, right? And all down the line, throughout history, there are only 4 people who are attributed to writing those Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are no other authors given. We saw early use in early works, right? So that was a pass. Integration into other historical sources, right? We saw people were quoting the Bible and using it in their other writings. That it was commonplace. So, did we answer the question? Who wrote the Gospels? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There you go. There's who wrote the Gospels. And this, and like I said, what I was going to do tonight is just give you an information dump. And I did. I hope I maybe just overloaded and you're like, okay, whatever, they wrote it. Just leave me alone. And this barely scratches the surface. When you want to dig into church history and all of the evidence for it, this is like just, this is the tip of the iceberg, right? And what's underwater of an iceberg? A whole bunch more. And so, yeah. A few minutes remaining. Anything left in there for thoughts, comments, or questions? Are you pretty much mind blown? Leave me alone. Yeah. All right. Well, like I said, I knew it was going to be information overload. That's why I gave you the detailed notes. That's why I made the timeline chart there. In it, guys, and this is just something that's just really been on my heart, that we live in a culture, in a society where they are pushing against Christianity, saying this is false, it's fake, it's a fairy tale, it's not true. And unfortunately, over the last century, the church has not been equipping itself to know why it's false. Your average person in the church has no idea who Irenaeus and Tertullian and Polycarp is. No clue. They may have heard the names. There's some old guys that did something way back when, right? And so, but it's out there. This information's out there.
There's a revolution rising in our hearts and in our souls to rise above the normal, a generation bold. There's a hunger in our being to stand for what is right, in purity and passion, no matter what the price. And all of me